Alright, part two. Hooray. Okay, so now we're going to look at some famous people from the 1920s. We've already read about some, talked about some in class. Movies, some of the famous actors at the time were Charlie Chaplin. You guys would definitely recognize him if you've seen any of the old silent films. Pretty hilarious guy. Rudolph Valentino, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and Greta Garbo. They're all very famous actors and actresses from the 1920s. Um, Charlie Chaplin is hilarious. I'll have to, if you guys remember to, on Monday, ask me to show you guys a video of Charlie Chaplin. He's pretty entertaining. There's one where he gets a job at a grocery store or hardware store or something like that. I'll see if I can find it. It's hilarious though. Okay, so in sports, really famous athlete from the time was Jim Thorpe. He was a really gifted athlete. Played football, was a really good track star, won some gold medals. Just really gifted athlete. In tennis, Helen Wells was really famous. Red Grange in football. Babe Ruth in baseball, probably heard of him before. Satchel Paige and Papa Bell were in the Negro Leagues. Satchel Paige, really well known. I'd be amazed if some of you baseball guys haven't heard of Satchel Paige before, but really gifted athlete as well. And Charles Lindbergh, which if you had me for E period this past week, you read a story about him, but he's a pilot. He's the first to fly across the Atlantic in 1927. Flew a plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. Really famous pilot, became world renowned after this, and had some unfortunate things happen later on in life. But he was a really famous pilot, and kind of like a superstar at the time. And then Amelia Earhart was a female pilot, and if you've seen like Night at the Museum movies, you've seen Amelia Earhart in that, but she disappeared in 1937. No one's really sure exactly what happened with her. So those are famous people from the 1920s. Hopefully you've heard of some of these people. Okay, so I'm going to show you some pictures. Oh no! Wah. Okay, so there's Charlie Chaplin. You probably recognize him. Greta Garbo, she's pretty recognizable. Douglas Fairbanks, I don't know that you guys would have seen him, or Rudy Valentino, but you definitely should have seen at least Charlie Chaplin. There's Mary Pickford, Red Grange. Look at those old helmets. Talk about concussion research. And Jim Thorpe, not a small guy. I don't think you'd want to tangle with him. And then there's tennis player Helen Wells, Babe Ruth, Satchel Paige, and Papa Bell. There's Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart. Okay, so blues and jazz. Music was really popular at the time. We talked about the fact that they didn't have TV or anything like that, so their main entertainment was radio, and that was really picking up the 1920s. And so there was a lot of emphasis on music as culture, and so ragtime, blues, and jazz were all very popular during this time period. Jazz was really picking up, and it basically spreads with the Great Migration. It spreads from the south to the north, and it really leads a lot of African American culture into the mainstream culture because jazz originated and blues originated as African American music, and it's brought from the south to the north when a lot of African Americans migrate from the south to the north during the 1920s. The main dude that you hear about when you hear about ragtime is Scott Joplin. I played you some of his music earlier this year. Really syncopated piano stuff, really cool. Blues, W.C. Handy and Bessie Smith. I'll have to play some of that for you guys in class. And then jazz, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington are kind of the two that everyone knows about from this time period. And you will have heard some of this jazz on Friday in class. So one of the areas that African Americans settle when they move to New York is called Harlem, and it's a part of basically if you're in Manhattan and you head north, but you're still in Manhattan. Basically, Harlem is like the very far north part of Manhattan, and that's where a lot of African Americans settled in. and it was a place where a lot of flappers would have hung out. There was a lot of speakeasies, there was a lot of jazz bars and blues bars, and a lot of African Americans became well known at this time. And it was a time period where basically African American culture goes from being marginalized by whites to basically being kind of, I don't want to use the word integrated, but kind of brought into the mainstream. So like it went from basically being only African Americans listening to jazz and going to these places to, with the Harlem Renaissance, whites from Manhattan would go up to Harlem to go and hear the jazz musicians and go to these speakeasies. And so there was a lot of African Americans that were becoming very artistic at the time, musically, poetically, and people would go and hear them perform. One of the most famous poets at the time, Langston Hughes. If you have not read some of his poetry, you will in high school. Very impressive poetry. Lost Generation were basically men that were back from World War One, and they were kind of just, as you can imagine, having seen the photographs of the destruction after World War One, kind of just disenfranchised, disgusted. I can't think of another adjective, exhausted of that mentality of men that leads to the destruction of other men, and so they were called the Lost Generation. Some of the famous authors from this, Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. If you have not read either of their works, you will definitely in the future. Ernest Hemingway is a pretty interesting guy. He's a world traveler. Fought in World War One, was really gifted writer. He's just kind of an interesting character. If you don't know much about him, you should do a little research on him because he's pretty interesting. And a lot of the people that were part of the Lost Generation were also expatriates, and they were basically people that left their country, typically the United States, to live elsewhere, typically Europe. Okay, and a lot of authors at the time would have left the United States or left other parts of Western Europe to move to other parts of the world. So some photographs. There's Scott Joplin, ragtime musician, W.C. Handy and Bessie Smith. Louis Armstrong, very recognizable, and Duke Ellington. I like the top hat. That's pretty slick. Langston Hughes, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway. Doesn't Ernest Hemingway just look like he'd have some stories to tell? Okay, stock market crash. We're going to just cover one last slide here, and I think we'll be done. So there was a lot of agricultural problems in the mid-1920s. There was a lot of overproduction, and basically the prices dropped in the 1920s because there was a lot more people farming. There was a lot more effective methods. We talked about how there was industrialization, and that goes for farming as well. People aren't using mules and horses so much anymore as big tractors and combines and things like that really speed up the process. And when it speeds up the process, it means that you can do more each day, which means you can grow more, which means you can sell more. But the problem with that is if everyone's doing that, the prices drop, and now nobody's making as much money. Okay. In a bull market, stock market prices rise or increasing. It's like it's charging forward. It's like a bull. Okay. A bear market is when the stock market prices drop. All right. So in the late 20s, there was in the 20s there was a lot of bull market because everything was growing, things were good, and then all of a sudden there was a crash. Okay. And one of the major problems with the stock market crash at the time was that you could go into a bank and you could borrow money from the bank and then turn around and purchase stock with that. Okay. The problem with that is, well, if you borrow money from a bank, you have to pay it back. And if you put it into stocks and the stock does not increase its money, it does not go up, then you lose your money and you can't pay back the bank. And if the bank doesn't get their money back, then you can't get your money out of the bank. If your neighbor borrowed a bunch of money from the bank and gambled it on Stevenson's, ice skate company, and my ice skate company does really poorly and he can't pay his money back to the bank, and you try to go to the bank to get some money out, and the bank says we don't have any money because everybody played the stock market. So basically there was a lot of banking problems because of people buying on credit. and people put a lot of money into really high risk investments to try and earn a profit. Some really sketchy things were going on with the stock market, and people were basically trying to manipulate other people to try and get them to invest money into things that were not very reliable. And well, when they did not succeed, people lost a lot of money. And so in 1929, there was Black Tuesday, which when the stock market basically completely collapses, and all these people that were speculators and people that bought stocks on credit lost all their money, and then the banks then couldn't get their money back from the people that borrowed on credit, and so then the banks were basically running out of money, and so then people went into their banks because they heard the banks were running out of money, and they tried to take all their money out, which made the banks have even less money, and basically then the banking system collapsed. And so basically everything the economy just collapses at this point. Okay. So that's where we're going to stop for this video. We're going to pick up there. So the next video is going to basically pick up with the economy collapse, and we're going to talk about what happens next with the Great Depression.